clock struck 5:15 p.m. in the heart of Chicago's downtown district. The sound of traffic outside mixed with the drone of office phones ringing and the murmur of conversations from the break room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the stuffy corporate office, casting a cold, artificial glow over the rows of cubicles. The usual hum of the workplace was coming to a close, but for Sarah it felt like any other night. She was still at her desk, fingers poised over the keyboard, typing up the final details of a report that would be buried in the deep files of corporate bureaucracy. She had spent hours on it. The numbers were perfect, the formatting precise, the content flawless, but no one would notice. Her eyes flickered toward Greg's office door. He was sitting there, as always, feet propped up on his desk. His tailored suit, his expensive shoes, he was the kind of guy who walked into a room and expected to be noticed. His smooth, confident grin was the kind that carried an air of entitlement. But Sarah wasn't looking at his face. She was looking at his chair, the one where he sat every day, like a king on his throne, reigning over the department he barely understood. He barely noticed her, of course. Sarah had worked here for over 7 years, pouring every ounce of energy into her work, but she was never part of the conversation when it came to the important decisions. Greg always took the credit for everything. It didn't matter that Sarah had done the bulk of the research, or that her ideas fueled half of the successful projects they'd put out in the last year. The loudest voice in the room was always the one that mattered, not the quiet worker who sat behind the scenes making it all happen. Sarah glanced at her reflection in the glass wall of her cubicle. Her brown hair was tied back in a no-nonsense bun, and her navy blouse was neatly tucked into a pencil skirt that barely showed any of her personality. She had never been one to seek attention, but she couldn't help feeling like she'd been invisible for far too long. She wondered if it had always been this way, if she had always been overlooked by people like Greg, or if it was just that her time had never come. But today it felt different. There was something about this evening, about the way the light was fading outside the window, casting shadows across the office floor, that felt like it was signaling a shift. Maybe it was the fact that, for once, she was done pretending. Done pretending to be satisfied with the steady, dependable role she played. Done pretending to be okay with being passed over for promotions, with watching people who didn't work as hard as she did get what was rightfully hers. Sarah had been quiet for so long. She had played by the rules. She had kept her head down. She had been the employee who showed up early, who stayed late, who was always dependable. She had done everything right, but somewhere along the way she had lost herself. Her gaze lingered for a moment longer in Greg's office. She had worked with him long enough to know that his days at the company weren't as secure as he thought they were. But then again, he didn't know that yet. He hadn't seen the storm brewing behind the quiet facade she had so carefully cultivated. The elevator dinged, and Sarah snapped out of her thoughts. She glanced at the door, half expecting Greg to stroll past her on his way to the exit. But instead, the office was quiet. He was still in his office, likely focused on whatever nonsense he was doing to justify his role. The elevator doors slid open, and out stepped Elaine, one of Sarah's closest colleagues. Elaine had been with the company almost as long as Sarah, but unlike her, Elaine had never been one to stay quiet. She was brash, outspoken, and unafraid to demand recognition. She had always told Sarah, "You're too damn humble, girl. You need to make some noise." But Sarah wasn't like that. She had always believed that if you just worked hard enough, your efforts would speak for themselves. People would see you, but that hadn't happened. Elaine stopped by Sarah's desk, a smile on her face. "Are you heading out soon?" Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. Got a little more to finish up." Elaine eyed her for a moment, studying her. "You know, Sarah, you're way too good for this place." She pointed toward Greg's office. "He's never going to see it. He doesn't even know how you're the one carrying half this damn company. But you keep doing the work, and that's all you get. No thanks, no recognition, no nothing." Sarah let out a soft laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just doing my job." Elaine narrowed her eyes. "No, you're not. You're doing his job." She jabbed a finger in the direction of Greg's office. "And one day he's going to realize it. And when he does, he's going to be too late." Sarah sat back in her chair, the words echoing in her mind. Elaine had always been the bold one. She didn't care what people thought of her. But Sarah? She had always been more reserved. Maybe too reserved. It wasn't that she lacked ambition. It was that she lacked the confidence to assert herself. She had always worried that if she stepped out of line, if she made waves, she would be seen as disruptive or worse, ungrateful. But in that moment, something inside her shifted. Elaine's words planted a seed, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah realized something. She had been waiting for Greg to see her, but maybe it was time for her to see herself first. The elevator doors opened again, and this time it was Greg. He looked at Sarah, gave her a quick nod, and muttered, "Good work today." He didn't stop. He never stopped. Sarah watched him leave. There was no grand gesture, no praise. He was just another cog in the machine, oblivious to the real talent in the room. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah gathered her things. She stood up from her desk, stretching her back. The office was beginning to empty out. People were slowly trickling out for the night. But Sarah stayed, long after everyone else had left. She stood by the window, watching as the city lights flickered to life below. Chicago had always been home. The energy of the city, the constant motion. It felt like the only thing that was real to her. She had spent years here, working hard, doing what was expected of her. But that was going to change. She wasn't going to wait for Greg anymore. She wasn't going to wait for anyone to give her the opportunity. Her time had come, and it was going to be quiet. If this story touched you, share your city in the comments. Let's see how far quiet strength travels. Sarah's days began to blur together in a rhythm she couldn't escape. It wasn't that the work had become less meaningful or that the challenges had diminished. It was the weight of knowing that no matter how much effort she put in, her value in the company's eyes was still not enough. She lived in a small, two-bedroom apartment on the north side of Chicago, far from the glamorous downtown where the company's headquarters stood. Her neighbors, a young couple with a baby and an elderly man who played chess with his cat every afternoon, made the area feel both homey and detached from the fast-paced world she spent her days in. There was a quiet comfort in the familiarity of it all. Each morning, Sarah would walk to the coffee shop across the street. The bell above the door would jingle softly, and she would be greeted by Mia, the barista who always had a smile that could brighten the coldest of mornings. "The usual?" Mia would ask, pouring Sarah's coffee before she even said a word. Sarah smiled back. "Thanks, Mia." It was the small things, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the warmth of the cup in her hand, the comforting predictability of it all, that kept her grounded. As she walked to work, she'd pass the park where kids played and old men sat on benches, chatting in thick Chicago accents. She always thought about how different her world was from theirs, yet how the city, this place, had somehow become a part of her. But as Sarah walked through the lobby of the office building, passing the polished floors and the high-end decor, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. This was not the world she was meant to be a part of. Yet, she had somehow found herself entrenched in it, fighting for recognition in a space where she was invisible. At her desk, the hum of the office felt like a constant buzz in the background, a reminder that no one saw her the way she needed them to. She sat there every day, working diligently, delivering results, but the promotion she had been quietly working toward was slipping further and further out of reach. Every email she received, every comment from her manager, Greg, or from the other team members felt like it was just part of the routine. She was good at what she did, but it wasn't enough. They saw her as a worker, not a leader. As the weeks wore on, Sarah began to notice something that bothered her more than she cared to admit. There were moments when people treated her like an afterthought or worse, like a stepping stone to their own success. Greg, especially, seemed to never truly acknowledge her work. She had spent countless late nights on the projects he'd taken credit for, but whenever she pointed out the details she had contributed, he'd simply nod, brushing her off with a casual "thanks, Sarah," as if it were a mere formality. It wasn't just Greg, though. The others, the people who she'd assumed would be her peers, the ones who should have known better, they did the same. Whether it was at lunch, at meetings, or in the office hallway, no one ever took the time to really see her. It was as if she were a ghost, floating between the walls of the office, never truly a part of the team. And yet, every day Sarah showed up. She didn't stop. One morning, while reviewing the numbers for another project, she saw something in the data that no one else had noticed. It was a pattern in the market trends that no one had picked up on before. She quickly put together a presentation, detailing her findings and proposing a new strategy. It wasn't a groundbreaking idea, nothing that would change the world, but it was something important. She sat down at Greg's desk and knocked lightly on the doorframe. Greg barely looked up from his screen. "Hey Greg, I've got something I'd like to show you." His eyes flickered up for just a moment, his expression a mix of indifference and mild annoyance. "Not now, Sarah. I'm busy. Just email it to me." But Sarah didn't move. She was tired of being the person who always took a step back. She had spent years in the shadows, and something inside her had snapped. "Actually, I think this is important enough to go over now." Her voice was steady, calm, almost too calm. Greg looked at her now, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You always do this, don't you? Think you've got something to prove? I'll take a look at it later." "No," Sarah said, her voice firm. "You'll take a look at it now." Greg hesitated for a moment, the cocky arrogance beginning to fade from his expression. "Fine," he muttered, leaning back in his chair. "Go ahead." Sarah set up her presentation on the screen. She didn't rush through the slides. Instead, she explained her findings in a clear, concise manner. She showed how the numbers worked, how the data pointed to a shift in the market that could potentially save the company millions. As she spoke, she noticed Greg's eyes narrowing, his posture stiffening. For the first time, he was actually listening. When she finished, there was a brief silence. "Well," Greg said slowly, his voice almost begrudgingly respectful, "that's not bad. I'll send it to the team and get their thoughts." She nodded. "Thanks." As she walked back to her desk, Sarah felt something stir inside her. It wasn't satisfaction, exactly, but something else. A quiet confidence, like a seed of hope finally taking root. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she had thought. But as the days passed, the weight of that small victory seemed to diminish in the face of the bigger reality. Greg's acknowledgement wasn't enough. The same day she presented her findings, the company held a meeting to discuss the upcoming promotions, and Greg, despite the positive feedback he'd given her, was put forward for the next management role. Sarah couldn't help but feel the sting. She had done the work. She had found the solution, but it was Greg who was getting the credit. Again, the weight of it pressed on her chest as she sat at her desk, staring at the list of names of the people who would be promoted. Greg's name was at the top, and there, at the very bottom of the list, was hers, Sarah, the quiet worker who never made a fuss. As the days passed, she began to retreat further into herself. The fire that had started to burn in her chest began to dim. Perhaps it was true. Maybe no one would ever see her. Maybe she was just destined to be the overlooked, underappreciated worker who did all the heavy lifting while others took the credit. But even in those dark moments, when she wanted to let the anger and frustration consume her, Sarah knew one thing. She couldn't give up. Not yet. She walked to the window of her office and stared out at the city below. Chicago, her city, the place that had shaped her, that had tested her resolve. And in that moment, she realized that while her journey here might not have been what she expected, it had shaped her into something more. Something more than just the quiet worker. Something more than the woman they saw as invisible. She wasn't going to wait for someone to see her anymore. She was going to make them. If this story resonates with you, leave a comment with your thoughts. Quiet strength doesn't go unnoticed forever. The days that followed Sarah's presentation were filled with the quiet hum of office life, but they felt different. There was a tension in the air, a sense that things had shifted, though no one would admit it. Greg continued to occupy the spotlight, walking into meetings as if he owned the place. But Sarah noticed something. The way people spoke to him, the little signs of doubt in their voices. There were cracks in his facade, and she had seen them. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Sarah to sense that change was on the horizon. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something inside her knew that she was standing at the edge of something big. But standing on the edge also meant standing in the shadow of her own fear. Sarah had always been the quiet one, the one who did the work behind the scenes. Her colleagues didn't know the real Sarah, no one did. She wasn't just the office worker who did her job and went home. She was a woman with a vision, with a drive that no one had ever seen. As the week progressed, Sarah found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment. The city outside her window buzzed with life, but inside, her mind was a whirlwind of possibilities. She thought about what she wanted, what she was capable of. She thought about how long she had been silent, how long she had let others dictate her future. She wasn't just a cog in the machine. She wasn't just the person behind the scenes. She could be more. She could take the reins, take control of her life, and stop waiting for someone to give her permission to succeed. But with that realization came another, more terrifying thought. What if she failed? What if the world, the office, saw her for what she really was? Someone who had tried and fallen short. The next morning, Sarah stood at the bus stop on her way to work, the cold wind biting at her skin. The city's buildings loomed over her like silent giants, their windows reflecting the bright early light. The sound of traffic and people rushing to their destinations filled the air. For a brief moment, Sarah wondered if she had made a mistake. Maybe she was better off being unnoticed, staying in her lane. But then, as the bus pulled up, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. Across the street, a group of young professionals were standing outside a cafe, laughing and chatting in the kind of loud, boisterous way that came with success. One of them, a woman in a sharp suit, was holding court, telling a story while her colleagues hung on every word. Sarah watched them for a moment, the pang of jealousy striking her heart. It wasn't just the confidence in their voices, or the apparent ease with which they moved through the world. It was the fact that they didn't have to work as hard as she did to be seen. Their worth was already assumed. Why should I have to work so much harder than they do? Sarah wondered. Why am I constantly overlooked, always the one who has to prove myself? The thoughts ran through her mind as she boarded the bus, but she pushed them aside. She couldn't afford to dwell on them. Not today. As she entered the office, she passed by Greg's office door again. This time, she didn't pause. She walked straight past it, her head held high. The familiar dread in her chest seemed to fade just a little. The tightness in her shoulders loosened. Sarah had started to make small changes in her approach. She began speaking up more in meetings, not in a loud or confrontational way, but in a quiet, calculated manner. She offered suggestions, pointing out insights that she had noticed in the data. Sometimes, her words were met with silence, but other times, there was a glimmer of acknowledgement. A small nod, a raised eyebrow, a shift in someone's posture. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for Sarah to simply be heard. She had to make herself undeniable. One afternoon, she stayed late again, staring at the same spreadsheet that had consumed her for the past week. The numbers blurred together, but she didn't care. There was a detail, a small anomaly in the data that kept nagging at her. She kept looking, kept tweaking the formulas until she saw it. A trend that no one had noticed, one that could shift the company's strategy in a big way. But Sarah didn't rush to Greg's office. She didn't want to be brushed off again. This time, she knew she had to make a move on her own. She opened up a new email draft, carefully typing out her findings. She attached the spreadsheet, wrote a brief summary, and added a simple line, "I believe this is worth discussing." Before she could second-guess herself, she hit send. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen as if willing the message to disappear. What had she just done? The next day, she walked into the office like any other day, but there was a knot in her stomach. It was still early when she saw the email from Greg. Subject line, your analysis. She opened it quickly, not knowing what to expect. It was short. "Good catch, Sarah. Let's meet in the afternoon to discuss this further." For a moment, she just stared at the words. She'd never seen Greg acknowledge her work like this before. Never. It wasn't just a passing comment or a generic response. He had taken the time to recognize her effort. She had caught his attention, finally. But it wasn't enough for Sarah to just wait. She had to prove herself in that meeting. When the afternoon came, Sarah walked into the conference room with her head held high, her nerves simmering beneath the surface. Greg was already seated, tapping away on his phone, his usual air of superiority hanging around him like a cloud. Sarah took her seat and opened her laptop. As she began presenting her findings, she noticed a shift in the room. For the first time, people were listening to her. She wasn't just speaking to fill the silence. She was commanding the conversation. The data, her analysis, it was all there, but it was her delivery that changed everything. She noticed Greg's posture shifting. The usual smug look was gone, replaced by something akin to uncertainty. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't brush her off. He was paying attention, really paying attention. When she finished, there was a brief silence. Then Greg spoke. "Sarah, this is impressive," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I didn't expect you to come up with something like this. Good work." Sarah nodded. She didn't need his approval anymore. As the meeting ended, she felt a small sense of victory. It wasn't dramatic. There were no cheers, no applause, but there was a quiet shift in the air. A subtle acknowledgement that Sarah had taken her first step towards something bigger. She walked back to her desk with a new sense of purpose. The city outside seemed a little brighter, the weight on her shoulders a little lighter. She had proven her worth, not to Greg or anyone else, but to herself. If you've ever been in the shadows, trying to make yourself seen, share your story in the comments. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones who make the loudest impact. Sarah's days at the office began to feel like an entirely new chapter in her life. The shift wasn't dramatic. It wasn't as if she had overnight become the center of attention or started to break records with her achievements. But there was something different now. She wasn't the same person who had quietly worked in the shadows, hoping someone would notice her. She had stopped waiting for someone to validate her worth. Instead, she had started taking action. Every morning, as she walked into the office, she felt a sense of calm determination settle in her chest. It wasn't the kind of determination that demanded attention or applause. It was the kind of determination that quietly burned inside, like a steady flame that couldn't be snuffed out. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone anymore. She was doing this for herself. The small victories added up. Her contributions in meetings, the subtle suggestions she'd make, the moments where she spoke up with clarity and confidence. They all began to shift the way people viewed her. And it wasn't just Greg. Even her colleagues who had once overlooked her began to take note. One afternoon, she found herself in a meeting discussing the new direction for a project. The room was filled with the usual voices, people who had always been loud and forceful in their opinions. But Sarah wasn't intimidated. As the conversation swirled around, she waited for the right moment. And then, without hesitation, she spoke up. "I don't think this approach is going to work," Sarah said, her voice steady but firm. "We're overlooking a key market trend, and if we move forward with this strategy, we'll be leaving money on the table." There was a brief pause, as if everyone in the room had to recalibrate. They weren't used to hearing Sarah speak with such conviction. One of her colleagues, Mark, who had always been a bit dismissive of her ideas, raised an eyebrow. "You think you found something we missed?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Sarah didn't back down. "Yes, and I've outlined a new approach that can capitalize on this trend. I'll send the details over after the meeting." The silence in the room stretched for a moment before the team began to look over their notes, absorbing her words. Sarah could see the shift happening. People were paying attention, not just to the content of her proposal, but to the confidence with which she delivered it. It was a small victory, but it was hers. After the meeting, Sarah returned to her desk, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She had spoken her mind, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like her voice had actually mattered. She didn't need Greg's approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. She had done something that was, at its core, just for her. An expression of the quiet rebellion she had been nurturing inside her for months. That evening, when Sarah walked out of the office, the city felt different. The air was cooler, the streets a little quieter as the sun dipped below the skyline. There was a softness to the world around her that she hadn't noticed before. As she walked past the park near her apartment, she stopped for a moment to watch a group of kids playing basketball. Their laughter filled the air, pure and unguarded, a sound she had long forgotten. For the first time in a while, Sarah smiled to herself. She wasn't just a worker anymore. She wasn't just someone who did her job and went home. She was someone who was beginning to believe that she could be more. That night, as she sat in her small apartment, sipping a cup of tea, she thought about everything that had brought her to this point. She remembered the first time she walked into the office, the young woman eager to prove herself but unsure of her place. And now, here she was, quiet, unassuming, but with a strength that no one could ignore. The phone rang, breaking her reverie. It was Greg. "Sarah, I wanted to talk to you about today's meeting," he said, his voice sounding different than usual, almost cautious. "I've been thinking about your proposal, and I have to admit, you were right. We missed something big. Let's set up a follow-up meeting next week to discuss your new direction." Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small acknowledgement. "Thanks, Greg," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. "I'll send over the details first thing in the morning." As she hung up, she sat back in her chair, feeling a quiet sense of pride settle in her chest. She hadn't just earned Greg's respect. She had earned her own. But even as the acknowledgement from Greg and her colleagues began to come in, Sarah knew she was still on the edge of something bigger. It wasn't about recognition anymore. It was about what came next. What would she do now that she had started to carve out a space for herself? Her mind kept drifting back to that meeting. Her voice, calm and sure, cutting through the noise of the room. The quiet power she had unlocked wasn't just about being heard. It was about knowing her worth, even when the world around her seemed to overlook it. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself taking on more responsibility. She was no longer waiting for someone to assign her tasks or tell her what needed to be done. She saw what needed to be done, and she took it upon herself to make it happen. She spoke up in meetings not just to contribute, but to challenge the ideas that didn't sit right with her. She made connections with people she'd never thought to approach before, building relationships with others who, like her, had been overlooked by the louder voices in the room. But with this newfound power came a sense of unease. Sarah couldn't help but feel the pressure building, not just from the expectations around her, but from the tension within herself. The quiet rebellion she had begun was starting to feel less like a spark and more like a fire she couldn't control. What would happen when that fire finally broke free? What would she be willing to sacrifice to keep pushing forward? One evening, as she was leaving the office late, Sarah passed by Greg's office once again. This time, his door was cracked open, and she could see him sitting at his desk, staring at a stack of papers. For the first time in a long while, she felt a pang of something unfamiliar, a sense of understanding. Greg was no longer the confident leader who had dominated every conversation. He wasn't even the man who had looked down on her, ignoring her contributions. He was just another person, lost in his own struggle. And in that moment, Sarah realized something. She wasn't the only one who had been fighting for a place in this world. She walked past his office, and as she did, she made a decision. She wouldn't let fear or insecurity drive her anymore. She wasn't here to take Greg's job or anyone else's. She was here to make her own path, to prove that even the quietest voices could change the world. As she stepped into the elevator, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from having everything figured out. It was the peace that came from knowing that, for the first time in a long time, she was exactly where she needed to be. If you've ever found yourself in the background, waiting to be seen, share your story in the comments. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones who make the loudest impact. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah began to feel the weight of everything she had fought for. At first, the quiet wins had been enough to fuel her. Small victories that chipped away at the layers of invisibility that had once defined her. But now, she was starting to see the cost of everything she was striving toward. The stakes were higher, and so was the pressure. Her days at the office had shifted. No longer was she the woman sitting in the back, quietly doing the work. She was now an active participant in the conversation, challenging ideas, suggesting new directions. The team had started looking to her for input, and with that came expectations that felt increasingly impossible to meet. But it wasn't just the work that was weighing her down. It was everything else. Her family, her friends, the people who had once been her support system, they had all begun to feel like distant memories. She no longer had the time to go out for drinks after work, to visit her mother on the weekends, to catch up with the friends she had made years ago. Her phone buzzed one evening as she sat at her desk, trying to finish a proposal. It was a text from her mom. "Are you still coming over tomorrow for dinner? We haven't seen you in weeks." Sarah's heart sank. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd visited. The thought of facing her mom's concerned eyes made her feel guilty, but she didn't have time to worry about it now. There was too much to do. She couldn't afford to take time off for something as trivial as family dinner. She typed a quick response. "Sorry, Mom. I'm really tied up with work. Let's do it next weekend. Okay?" She stared at the text before pressing send. She could feel the weight of her decision, the way her life was slipping further out of balance. But there was no time to think about it. There was only work, deadlines, and the constant race to prove that she was worth something in a world that seemed to value everything but her quiet contributions. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was from Elaine, her former colleague and one of the few people who had ever seen her potential. "Hey girl, haven't heard from you in a while. Miss our chats. Are you good?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. She had grown used to the loneliness of the office, the long hours spent in her cubicle, her only companion the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. It wasn't that she didn't want to reconnect with people, but she had become consumed by the work, by the need to prove herself. She had abandoned the small pieces of her life that used to matter. She typed a response. "Yeah, just busy. I'll catch up with you soon." The words felt empty, like a promise she would never keep. It wasn't just her personal life that was slipping away. Her relationships at work had begun to feel strained as well. The once easy camaraderie she had shared with some colleagues had started to fray at the edges. They resented her for speaking up more, for challenging the status quo. Mark, in particular, had become more pointed in his comments. The same man who had once questioned her during meetings now seemed to look for any excuse to undermine her ideas. One afternoon, Sarah sat at her desk, reviewing a new project proposal. She had spent hours on it, refining every detail, ensuring it was perfect. She sent it over to Greg for approval, waiting for the usual response. Quick feedback, a few changes, and a prompt "good job." But this time, the feedback was different. "You missed a key detail here," Greg had written in his email. "Make sure you add the market data from the last quarter. We need to look more closely at the trends." Sarah blinked at the screen. She hadn't missed anything. She had reviewed the data, double-checked everything. She knew this project better than anyone. She had been the one to point out the trends in the first place. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she began to type a response. She was tempted to correct Greg, to point out that the information he was asking for had already been included. But something inside her held her back. She wasn't sure if it was pride or fear, but for the first time, she hesitated. She erased the email and simply replied, "Got it. I'll add the data and send it back to you." As soon as she hit send, the guilt settled in. It wasn't just the small adjustments to the project. It was the bigger picture, the loss of control over her own life, over her own decisions. She was no longer just fighting to prove herself to Greg, to her colleagues, to anyone. She was fighting against the person she had become, the woman who had buried her true self under the weight of ambition and the need for validation. That night, Sarah lay in bed, unable to sleep. The room was dark, save for the glow of the city lights creeping through the blinds. She stared at the ceiling, feeling the ache in her chest. She missed her mother. She missed her friends. She missed the days when her life had been hers to live, when she hadn't been constantly measuring herself against others. But she had made a choice. She had chosen this path. She had chosen to fight for her place in a world that had never given her one. And now that fight was costing her everything. The next day at work, Sarah pushed through the discomfort, the gnawing feeling in her gut. She finished the project and sent it back to Greg. But something had shifted. The task no longer felt like a victory. It was just another checkbox on a never-ending list. That afternoon, Greg called her into his office. She hesitated before knocking on the door, but she steeled herself and entered. "Sarah, I wanted to talk about the proposal," Greg said, his voice lacking its usual warmth. "You did good work, but there are still some areas that need improvement. You missed some key insights." Sarah forced a smile, but inside, her heart sank. This was becoming a pattern. Her work, her efforts, always falling short in the eyes of those who held the power. "Okay, Greg," she said, her voice steady. "I'll take another look." As she left his office, a sense of resignation washed over her. She had given so much of herself to this job, to proving that she was worthy, that she had lost sight of what mattered. She had become just another cog in the machine, grinding away day after day, with no real reward at the end of it. And it was starting to feel like there was no way out. If you've ever felt like you're giving everything and getting nothing in return, share your story in the comments. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. By the time Sarah reached the final stages of the project she had been working on for months, she had become someone unrecognizable to herself. The quiet, hopeful woman who had once wanted nothing more than to prove herself in the world now stood at the precipice of something much bigger, but also more lonely and unfulfilled. Every day, she felt as though she were sinking deeper into the sea of ambition, and yet, the further she went, the harder it was to breathe. The office was alive with the hum of productivity as always. Sarah's workstation had become her second home, where every hour seemed to stretch into the next, and the silence of her solitary work was interrupted only by the click of her keyboard and the occasional hum of the fluorescent lights above her head. She spent late nights at her desk, not out of necessity, but because she couldn't bring herself to leave. Every click of her mouse, every word she typed, felt like a small battle she had to win against the overwhelming weight of everything she had put on hold. But today was different. Today, she had reached a turning point, and there was something in the air that felt lighter than it had in months. She could sense the anticipation, the pressure, mounting within the walls of the office, as if everyone knew that the project Sarah had been spearheading was about to go live. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever before. The work she had done would be presented to the board later that afternoon. The results of her months of effort would now be judged, scrutinized, and either celebrated or condemned. But Sarah had done it. The numbers were aligned, the strategy flawless, and the data presentation had been perfected to the point that it was impossible for anyone to ignore. This was the moment she had worked for, the moment that was supposed to make everything worth it. All those sleepless nights, the quiet sacrifices, the frustrations. This was it. She clicked send on the final draft of the proposal and sat back in her chair. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, but from something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, relief. As she sat there, looking at the glowing screen, her mind began to drift back to the months of struggle, to the quiet isolation she had come to accept as part of the process. She had spent so much time focusing on winning approval, on being recognized, that she had neglected to ask herself one simple question. What do I really want? She had been so caught up in the game, in the climb, that she hadn't stopped to realize that the very success she was chasing had come at the cost of the things that truly mattered: family, friends, personal well-being. She had neglected herself in pursuit of a dream that, in the end, felt more hollow with each passing day. But now, at this moment, she had a choice. She had the chance to redefine what success meant to her. "Sarah, are you ready?" Elaine's voice broke her from her thoughts. Sarah turned to see her colleague standing at the doorway of her cubicle, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Sarah nodded, her own smile forming, though it felt a little strained. "Yeah, I think I am," she replied, her voice steady but not without a hint of the nerves that had built up over the past few weeks. Elaine gave her a thumbs up. "You've got this. Just remember, this is your moment. You've earned it." Sarah watched as Elaine walked away, the words echoing in her mind. Your moment. Has it really come? Was this what it felt like to step into the life she had always wanted? She took a deep breath and stood, gathering the documents she needed for the board presentation. As she stepped into the conference room, the familiar faces of her colleagues and superiors greeted her with polite nods. Greg, of course, was already seated at the head of the table, looking over his notes with his usual air of detached confidence. Sarah, however, was no longer the woman who had walked into the room months ago, quiet and hesitant. She stood taller now, shoulders squared, her heart still racing but her mind clearer than ever before. This was her time. She had earned the right to be here, and she was going to take it. Greg glanced up as she approached and gave her a nod. All right, Sarah, let's see what you've got. His voice was businesslike, but Sarah could hear a faint note of surprise in it. Perhaps he hadn't expected her to bring something this substantial to the table. Sarah took a deep breath and began. She didn't rush through the presentation. Instead, she took her time, laying out each point with calm precision. Her voice, steady and confident, filled the room. She spoke about the market trends, the data, and how her strategy was tailored to maximize the company's growth in a way no one had anticipated. She could feel the room shifting as she spoke, people leaning forward in their seats, eyes narrowing in interest. By the time she reached the conclusion, she could sense that she had them. The data spoke for itself, but it was her conviction that made it undeniable. The quiet woman who had once been dismissed, overlooked, was now the one everyone was listening to. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. Greg was the first to speak. Impressive work, Sarah, he said, his tone neutral but with an edge of surprise in his voice. I didn't expect this level of detail. You've really outdone yourself. Sarah nodded, the satisfaction of those words settling into her bones. But she didn't feel the rush of vindication that she had expected. Instead, there was a quiet sense of peace, a realization that this moment didn't have to be the end of something. Could be the beginning. The board members exchanged glances before nodding in agreement. Let's move forward with your proposal, one of them said. We'll need a follow-up meeting to discuss implementation, but this looks solid. As the meeting ended and the room began to empty, Sarah stayed seated for a moment longer. She had done it, but as the adrenaline from the presentation slowly ebbed away, she felt the weight of something deeper. She wasn't just relieved, she was transformed. She had spent so long fighting for validation, for recognition, but now she realized that none of it had been as important as the quiet confidence that had grown within her. It wasn't about proving her worth to anyone else. It was about proving it to herself. When Sarah left the conference room, she was no longer the same person who had walked in. She was still the same woman, reserved, thoughtful, cautious. But now, she had the courage to step into her own light. As she walked back to her desk, her phone buzzed with a message from Elaine. I knew you could do it. I'm so proud of you. For the first time in what felt like years, Sarah allowed herself to feel the pride she had worked so hard to earn. But it wasn't just about the project or the promotion that would inevitably follow. It was about everything she had learned about herself. The quiet power, the unspoken strength, the unshakable belief that she had something valuable to offer the world, even if no one else saw it at first. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. If you've ever doubted yourself but kept pushing anyway, share your story in the comments. It's the quiet ones who always have the loudest impact. A week had passed since the board meeting, and Sarah found herself at a crossroads. The sense of triumph she had felt after the presentation had slowly shifted into something quieter, something more reflective. The recognition from her colleagues, Greg's reluctant admiration, and the follow-up meetings had all felt rewarding. But as the days passed, Sarah began to realize that her journey was not just about earning respect or climbing the corporate ladder. It was about reclaiming herself. She had won that moment, yes, but the deeper victory was still unfolding. On a crisp Friday afternoon, as Sarah sat at her desk reviewing the final details of a new proposal, she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Elaine again, her old friend and one of the few people who had truly supported her through this journey. "Hey," Elaine said, leaning over the edge of Sarah's cubicle. "You've got another email from Greg." She paused, glancing over at the screen. "It's marked urgent." Sarah raised an eyebrow but didn't react. She had been on edge for the past week, wondering if the success of the project would come back to bite her. Greg, though seemingly impressed, had a tendency to keep his distance after any form of praise. She clicked the email open, her heart stilling as she read the message. "Sarah, I've been reviewing the data from the board meeting and the proposal you submitted, and there's something we need to address. Let's meet as soon as possible. I'll send over the details." Her stomach twisted. The unease that had been lingering ever since that meeting suddenly intensified. What had she missed? Was something wrong? The air in her cubicle felt thicker than before. "Is everything okay?" Elaine asked, sensing the tension in Sarah's expression. Sarah shook her head, trying to shake off the feeling of dread. "I don't know. I guess I'll find out soon enough." She stood up, grabbing her notes and walking toward Greg's office. Her pulse quickened as she knocked softly on his door and entered. He looked up from behind his desk, his face unreadable. "Come in," Greg said, gesturing for her to take a seat. She sat across from him, trying to steady her breathing, but there was something in his demeanor that made her nervous. She couldn't put her finger on it, but it was different from the usual aloofness he often carried. This time he seemed uncertain. "Sarah," he began, his tone softer than she expected. "I wanted to follow up on the presentation. Your work was, as I said before, impressive. But there's something I didn't tell you in the meeting." Her heart skipped a beat. "You're right, Greg," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "I was hoping to get some feedback on the areas you wanted me to tweak." Greg leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "No, it's not that," he replied slowly. "The thing is, I had no idea how far-reaching your proposal really was. The strategy you laid out, it's not just something we can use for this project. It could change the direction of the entire department." Sarah blinked. "What do you mean?" He paused, considering his words carefully. "I mean, your insights are not just relevant to our immediate goals. They could transform the way we approach the market moving forward. But there's a problem. We didn't see it before." "Go on," she prompted, trying to stay composed. Greg's eyes flickered with a hint of unease, but he continued. "The truth is, we missed it. We missed you." Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't expected those words. He wasn't just acknowledging her work. He was acknowledging her presence in a way that had never happened before. "I've been blind to what you've been doing," Greg said, his voice tinged with a rare vulnerability. "I've always assumed the real work was done by the usual suspects, the ones who get the attention and the praise. But you've been under my nose the entire time, doing the work that no one else wanted to do. And I never saw it. I never saw you. Not truly." Sarah was silent for a moment, her thoughts racing. She had spent so many years fighting for recognition, working twice as hard just to be acknowledged. But now, here was Greg, the very man who had overlooked her for years, finally admitting that she had been right all along. For a moment, she felt a deep sense of vindication. It was a quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. But then, she felt something else. A weight lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was just free. Greg continued, seemingly unaware of the shift in Sarah's expression. "I've been thinking, Sarah. I don't know if you've noticed, but the company's priorities are changing. We're moving toward a more forward-thinking, data-driven approach. And I want you to be part of it. I want you to lead the charge on this." Her mind raced. Could this be real? Was this finally the opportunity she had been waiting for? She had spent so much time working to prove herself that she hadn't stopped to wonder if the real opportunity had been there all along. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Greg, I don't know what to say. I've been working toward something like this for years. But you're right. I've been doing it for myself. I'm not sure I even know what's next for me." Greg nodded, a rare sincerity in his eyes. "Take your time. This is about you, not about the company." We'll support you in whatever direction you choose." Sarah felt a rush of emotions flood her. She had been so focused on this moment, on proving herself, that she hadn't realized how much of her life had been consumed by the pursuit of validation. She had spent so long trying to climb the ladder that she had lost touch with what it meant to live authentically. And now, here she was, standing at the threshold of something bigger than herself. A chance not just to prove her worth, but to redefine what success meant for her. "I'll think about it, Greg," she said, her voice firm but filled with new resolve. "But I think it's time for me to define my own path. I've spent too long letting others decide who I am." Greg smiled, a small, almost imperceptible shift in his usual demeanor. "I respect that, Sarah. I truly do. And no matter what you decide, I'm behind you." As Sarah left Greg's office, she felt lighter than she had in months. There was no rush to celebrate, no need for anyone else's approval. She had earned this moment, not by following the traditional path, but by doing things her way. She stepped outside into the cool Chicago air, feeling the breeze ruffle her hair. The city felt alive with possibility. She was finally stepping into her own power, not in a loud, forceful way, but in a quiet, confident rebellion against everything she had once accepted. For the first time, Sarah was no longer just surviving. She was living on her own terms, and the world was wide open in front of her. If you've ever had to prove your worth but found strength in your own quiet journey, share your story in the comments. It's never too late to define your own success. The days after her conversation with Greg were a blur. For the first time in what felt like years, Sarah had the space to breathe, to think, and to feel what was truly happening inside her. She had been running on autopilot for so long, so consumed with the need to prove herself, that she hadn't fully understood the depth of the transformation that had already begun. It wasn't about the promotion anymore. It wasn't about the job title or the recognition. What mattered now was the realization that the fight she had been waging was not just about the external world. It was about her own internal battle, learning to see herself for who she truly was, not as the person the world had told her she should be. For the first time, Sarah felt the weight of that lesson sink in. She didn't need validation from others to know her worth. She didn't need to be seen in order to exist. But the road to this realization had been long and filled with sacrifices. Her phone buzzed one afternoon as she sat at her desk, taking a rare break from the non-stop whirlwind of work that had consumed her. It was from her mother. "Sweetie, I haven't heard from you in weeks. Are you okay? Let's have dinner this weekend, please." The message hit her like a wave. She hadn't even realized how much time had passed since she'd last seen her mom. The guilt rushed in, sharp and sudden. She had been so focused on the success that seemed to be just out of reach, on climbing the ladder and proving her worth to everyone at the office, that she had forgotten what really mattered. She picked up the phone and dialed her mother's number. "Hi, Mom," Sarah said, her voice softer than usual. "I'm so sorry I've been distant. I've been wrapped up in work, but I'm free this weekend. Let's have dinner like we used to." There was a pause on the other end of the line before her mother's warm voice responded. "You're working too hard, Sarah. You know you're always welcome here. Just promise me you'll take some time for yourself. Okay?" "I promise," Sarah said, closing her eyes as she felt a wave of emotion flood through her. "I really promise." Hanging up, Sarah sat back in her chair, feeling a new sense of clarity settle in. She had always prided herself on her work ethic, on her ability to push through and achieve whatever she set her mind to. But somewhere along the way, she had lost touch with the parts of her life that had once brought her joy. The quiet evenings with her mother, the small moments of connection with friends. She had forgotten that life wasn't just about work. It was about balance, about being present for the people who mattered most. As she thought about everything that had happened, Sarah realized something else. Something that had been hiding beneath the surface all along. Her sense of self-worth had never come from the job, or from Greg's approval, or from the praise she received. It had always come from within, from the quiet confidence that had been growing inside her since the very first day she decided to stop waiting for others to see her. The world didn't owe her anything, but she owed herself everything. The next morning, as Sarah walked into the office, There was a shift in the air. She wasn't walking in with the same sense of urgency or the same need to prove herself that she had felt in the past. Instead, she was walking in with purpose, with an understanding that her work was important, but it didn't define her. She smiled at Elaine as she passed her desk. "Hey, are you free for lunch today?" she asked, her voice light and easy. Elaine looked up from her screen, a surprised smile spreading across her face. "Of course. I was just thinking we haven't caught up in forever. Let's go grab something." As they walked down the street together, Sarah felt something in her shift. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. She was truly present, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, listening to Elaine's animated stories about her own work struggles. It wasn't about who was ahead, who was behind, or who had the most impressive accomplishments. It was about the connection they shared, about the joy of friendship, and about the small, quiet victories that truly mattered. Over lunch, Sarah found herself talking to Elaine about her recent experience with Greg. "I've been thinking a lot," Sarah said, her voice steady but thoughtful. "About everything, about the work, the success, the things I've sacrificed along the way. I used to think it was all about climbing the ladder, proving I was worthy. But now, I realize it's not about that at all." Elaine nodded, taking a sip of her iced tea. "I've always said you were too hard on yourself. You've been doing amazing things, Sarah. But you're right. It's not just about the job or the promotion. It's about who you are when no one's watching. And you've always had that quiet strength. You just needed to see it for yourself." Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of Elaine's words settle in her heart. "I think I finally got it. I've been so focused on making other people see my worth that I forgot to see it for myself." Elaine grinned. "Took you long enough, but seriously, you're exactly where you need to be. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Later that afternoon, Sarah received an email from Greg, marked "Follow-up." She opened it, expecting more of the usual business correspondence, but instead, the subject line was different. "Next steps, a new role for you." Her heart skipped a beat as she clicked open the email. "Sarah, after our last conversation, I've been thinking a lot about your contributions to the department and the company as a whole. I know I've been blind to your potential in the past, but I want to make sure that doesn't happen again. I'd like to offer you a leadership position, one that I think you've earned. We can discuss the details later, but I wanted to give you a heads up." Sarah blinked at the screen, her mind racing. For a moment, she didn't know how to feel. There was a sense of accomplishment, yes, but also a deep sense of peace that had been missing for so long. This wasn't just a job offer. This was a reminder that the journey she had been on wasn't about waiting for recognition. It was about finding her own path. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the email, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah smiled. Not because of the promotion, but because of what it represented. She had done this on her own terms. She had earned this moment through the quiet strength she had found within herself, not by proving herself to anyone else. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her mom. "Dinner tomorrow at 7. Can't wait to see you, sweetheart." Sarah typed back quickly. "Can't wait either. I'll be there." As she sat there, looking out the window at the city, Sarah realized that she wasn't just walking into a new chapter of her career. She was walking into a new phase of her life, one where success was defined not by the validation of others, but by her own belief in herself. She had finally learned that it wasn't the world that needed to change. It was her perspective that had shifted, and that shift had given her everything she needed. As she closed her laptop, Sarah knew that no matter what came next, she was ready. The quiet victories, the battles fought in the silence of her own heart, they had made her who she was. And no matter what happened, she would never again be the woman who doubted her worth. If you've ever had to fight for your worth or discover your own strength, share your journey in the comments. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we win within ourselves. It had been a week since Sarah's conversation with Greg, and the changes in her life had begun to settle in. The promotion was official now, no longer just a possibility, but a reality. She was being thrust into a leadership role, a position she had once dreamed of, but never truly believed she could reach. Her head was still spinning from the gravity of it all. She hadn't asked for this change, but now that it was here, it felt different than she had imagined. For the first time in a long while, Sarah wasn't running on autopilot. There were no longer any walls between her desires and her reality. There was no need to prove herself to anyone. She had proven herself to herself. Yet, as the days passed, the weight of the role she had accepted became increasingly apparent. The responsibility, the expectations, the decisions that needed to be made, they were daunting, but they were also a reflection of how far she had come. Every morning as she walked into the office, Sarah felt the heavy hum of her new position. People now looked at her with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and in some cases, envy. It was different than before. Before, she had been invisible, overlooked. Now, she was at the center of attention, and though she had earned the position, it didn't make her feel as invincible as she had expected. Instead, it felt like she had just stepped onto a high wire, one that stretched farther than she could see, with no safety net beneath her. One morning, Sarah walked into the conference room for a meeting with the senior leadership team. She had a new agenda, new plans, and a new sense of ownership over the projects that had once been someone else's responsibility. As she walked to the front of the room, the familiar faces of her colleagues greeted her, some with smiles, others with a cool professionalism that made her feel like an outsider in her own department. Greg was already seated at the head of the table, flipping through his notes. He glanced up as she entered. "Sarah, good to see you," he said, his voice polite but distant. She had gotten used to the formality of his interactions. Greg had always been that way, a man who kept his distance and showed little emotion, even when delivering praise. She smiled and nodded. "Thanks, Greg. I'm ready to get started." As the meeting began, Sarah spoke with authority, presenting her vision for the department. She outlined the strategies she believed would lead to success, drawing on the insights she had gained from her work and the new role she was stepping into. She had always been a quiet force in the office, but now, she was the one making the decisions. She had earned the right to speak up. And yet, as she spoke, a voice inside her hesitated. It wasn't self-doubt exactly. It was something deeper, a recognition that her success was not just about her individual contributions. It was about the team, about the people who had supported her, about the relationships she had cultivated. As Sarah spoke to the room, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the decisions she was about to make. She had always been the person who did the work, but now, she was the one who had to guide others through the work. After the meeting, Sarah sat back in her office, reflecting on everything that had been said, everything that had been shared. The weight of leadership was heavier than she had imagined. She had worked so hard to reach this point, but now that she was here, she found herself asking questions she hadn't considered before. What kind of leader did she want to be? Was it enough to simply be competent, or did she need to be something more, something that would inspire and drive her team to new heights? Her phone buzzed, and Sarah glanced at the screen. It was a message from Elaine. "Hey, how's everything going with the new role? You got this, girl. But don't forget to take a break and breathe. We need to catch up soon." The message made Sarah smile. Elaine had been her biggest cheerleader throughout this whole process. She had always seen the potential in Sarah, even when Sarah couldn't see it herself. But now, as Sarah sat there, trying to digest the weight of her new responsibilities, she realized that what she had achieved was more than just about the position. It was about the relationships she had nurtured along the way. It was about finding balance in the chaos of leadership. That evening, Sarah went home, feeling the familiar exhaustion set in. She sat on the couch with a cup of tea, staring out the window at the city skyline. The lights twinkled like a million possibilities in front of her. But she couldn't help but wonder if she was still chasing something she hadn't yet figured out. Her phone buzzed again. It was a call from her mother. Sarah had promised herself that she would take time for the things that mattered, and that included her family. "Hey, Mom," she answered, her voice softening. "Sarah, I'm so glad you called. I've been thinking about you all week. How's the new job going?" Her mother asked, her voice warm with concern. "It's good, Mom. It's a lot, but it's good. I think I'm starting to figure out what this all means for me." Sarah paused, thinking about her words. It's just hard, you know? There's so much responsibility. Sometimes, I wonder if I'm the right person for it. Her mother's voice was steady, comforting. You're the perfect person for it, sweetie. I've watched you work for so long, and I know what you're capable of. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. You're doing this for you, not just for everyone else. Sarah smiled, a wave of gratitude washing over her. Her mother had always been there for her, offering wisdom without judgment, love without expectation. In her mother's words, Sarah found a grounding force, a reminder that the work she was doing didn't have to come at the cost of everything else. Thanks, Mom. I needed to hear that. Sarah leaned back into the couch, feeling a weight lift from her chest. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to relax. The future was still uncertain, still full of questions she couldn't answer. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone in this journey. She had people who believed in her, people who would support her no matter what. The next day, Sarah returned to the office with a newfound sense of clarity. She still felt the pressure of her new role, the uncertainty of leading others, but now she also felt the strength to face those challenges head-on. She had spent so long proving her worth to others, but now, she was finally at peace with herself. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to have all the answers. She just needed to be true to herself, to the values that had always guided her. And as she sat at her desk, preparing for the next big presentation, she smiled quietly to herself. The road ahead was still long. There would be more challenges, more decisions to make, but Sarah was ready. Not because she was flawless or because she had all the answers, but because she had learned the most important lesson of all. She was enough. She was enough. If you've ever had to redefine what success means to you, share your journey in the comments. Sometimes, the real victory isn't in the title or the praise. It's in the quiet confidence that comes with knowing you've found your place. The months had passed, each one seeming to blur into the next. But now, Sarah was finally able to breathe. The work had become less of a grind, less of a battle, and more of a space she had carved out for herself. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt and uncertainty, but now they didn't seem insurmountable. The person Sarah had been when she first walked into the office felt like someone else entirely. She had grown, in ways she hadn't expected, and the person she was becoming was someone she could finally see, truly see. The weight of leadership had shifted, no longer feeling like an anchor pulling her down, but more like a tool she was learning to use. Sarah had come to understand that leadership wasn't about perfection or about being the loudest or most visible person in the room. It was about understanding herself, trusting her instincts, and guiding others with the same humility and integrity she had always tried to embody. Her team had flourished under her leadership, not because she had forced them to meet expectations, but because she had shown them what was possible through quiet strength. She had cultivated an environment where their voices were heard, where collaboration and support thrived. In return, they had shown her what true leadership could look like. Not power over others, but power shared. The bond between them had shifted from being that of a superior and subordinates to one of mutual respect, understanding, and growth. But, despite all of this, there was still something missing. Something deeper that Sarah had not yet fully confronted. She had spent years proving herself, fighting for her place in the world. But now that she had found her own space, she realized that she had been chasing something that couldn't be found in the external world. The real journey was internal. One morning, as Sarah sat at her desk reviewing reports, her mind wandered, and she glanced out the window. The city of Chicago spread out before her, vast and full of life, each building and street corner representing a world of possibilities. She had grown up here, spent years walking its streets, working in its shadows, and now, she was part of it in a way she had never imagined. She wasn't just another worker in the corporate world. She had become someone who shaped it, but there was something else. A pull to reconnect with the life she had left behind. With her mother, her friends, the small, everyday moments that she had sacrificed for the sake of her ambitions. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Elaine. "Hey, I was thinking about how much you've changed. You've been so focused on the office, and I get it. But what about you? When's the last time you did something for yourself? The words hit Sarah in a way she hadn't expected. She had been so consumed by her role as a leader that she had forgotten to take care of herself. She had put everything, her career, her success, her recognition, before her own well-being. She smiled at the text, knowing that Elaine was right. She had spent so long working toward external validation that she had neglected the most important validation of all. The kind that came from within. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that while she had made tremendous strides in her career, the work was never going to be enough if she couldn't find balance. That afternoon, after finishing her meetings, Sarah made a decision. She had spent so much time building a career, fighting for recognition, and chasing after goals. But now, it was time to take a step back and reconnect with herself. The first thing she did was reach out to her mom. It had been months since they'd had a real conversation, and she knew that she needed to rebuild that connection. "Hi, Mom," Sarah said when her mother answered the phone. "I'm sorry I've been so distant. I've been caught up in work, but I've realized that I need to make time for the things that really matter." There was a pause, and then her mother's voice was filled with warmth and understanding. "Sweetheart, I've missed you. I know how busy you've been, but I'm glad you're realizing what's important. I've always been proud of you, but don't forget to take care of yourself, too." The conversation was simple, but it felt like a weight had been lifted. It was a reminder that while work was important, it wasn't everything. The connections we build with others, the time we invest in nurturing relationships, were just as significant as any professional achievement. After hanging up, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't realized she had been missing. She had worked so hard to prove herself, but now she knew that the real work was in living a balanced, fulfilling life. Later that week, Sarah took a long weekend off, something she hadn't done in years. She spent time with her mother, visited old friends, and rediscovered the simple pleasures of life that had once made her feel grounded. It wasn't that the work didn't matter anymore. It was just that she had come to understand that there was more to life than career achievements. During that weekend, Sarah also spent time reflecting on the lessons she had learned. She thought back to the days when she had been invisible at the office, working hard without recognition, pushing herself to the limit to get noticed. She thought about the quiet rebellion that had started in her heart, the decision to stop waiting for others to see her and to see herself first. She thought about the small victories, those moments when she had taken control of her own destiny, when she had chosen to redefine what success meant to her. She realized that success wasn't just about the promotions, the accolades, or the recognition from others. Success was about the way she had grown into the woman she was today, the woman who understood her worth, who trusted herself, who no longer needed to be seen by anyone but herself. She had learned to lead with humility, to balance ambition with compassion, and to prioritize the things that truly mattered in life. But most importantly, she had learned to let go. Let go of the need for external validation. Let go of the pressures to constantly prove herself. Let go of the idea that success meant doing it alone. She had learned that real success came from being at peace with who she was, with the choices she had made, and with the life she was creating for herself. As Sarah returned to work, she did so with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't running toward a goal anymore. She wasn't chasing after something that might never be enough. She was moving forward, step by step, with confidence in who she was and in the path she was walking. And when the next challenge came, and it always did, she knew that she would face it not with fear, but with a quiet strength, rooted in the lessons she had learned and the woman she had become. The future was still uncertain, still full of unknowns, but Sarah was no longer afraid. She had found her place, not just in the world, but within herself. The journey had not been easy, but it had been worth it. And now, with every decision she made, Sarah could finally say that she was not just surviving, she was thriving. If you've ever had to let go of the chase for perfection and embrace who you truly are, share your story in the comments. Sometimes, the greatest victory is finding peace within ourselves.